फ्रंटियर वाला ऑप्शन रहेगा उस बार हम लोगों को कॉलेज में आया था मैंने फ्रंटियर के लिए रिक्वेस्ट किया एनेबल हो गया है cannot get agent how to work in Excel which is so
welcome everyone. I hope you're having a good conference so far. If you saw the keynote, lots of exciting things were covered there, and this is going to tie directly to some of this stuff. We're not going to be the cool new features show, although we do have some demos and other things that I think you'll find interesting. Some questions before we start. How many of you work with Power Automate? Okay. How many of you regularly build agents? Okay, so Power Automate had more hands. How many of you will admit to feeling a bit angsty about the cheese being moved, about the stuff you've been doing for a long time? Now this agent stuff is getting lots of it, and not knowing when we should do what or why we need that when we already can do it with Power Automate? Anybody brave enough to admit that? All right, great. So this is the session for you, and this is so. In case you were hoping to see Matt and me get into a big fight, this is not really a versus. He's taller than me, so he would beat me. This is rather, though, looking at when you should use which, how they work together, and how to know what your strategy should be and how to get the value out of these tools. My name is Joel Lindstrom. And I am a senior SSP with Hitachi Solutions, where I am a leader for Copilot Studio, Copilot Power Platform, and also before that a long-time Dynamics person. So that's my background. And Matt?
I'm Matthew Devani, and I'm a Power Platform architect at Hitachi Solutions. This is a very special moment for me because I'm sharing the stage with Mr. Joel Lindstrom here. I spent 10 years working as an accountant, but that's not what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to become a developer. So I spent all of my time, my hobby time, coding and blogging and on the Power Platform forums, answering questions. And then one day, Joel came into my inbox and he said, I'm starting up a Power Platform practice. You say you're an accountant, but you look like you're a developer. Would you like to come join the team? And so I'd just like a big round of applause for Joel for changing his trajectory. Agents. So the word agent is a very loose word these days, right? Things that weren't previously AI agents a few years ago suddenly are now. For example, how about a Roomba? You know, a little vacuum, runs around your house, picks up your stuff. Is that an AI agent now? Maybe, but do you think it's one? No, it's just a machine that maps out your house by running into walls, right? Kind of by brute force. And it determines the path that it's going to run on by using a predefined algorithm. So what might look like an agent actually isn't an agent at all. We just don't understand it fully, right? And so that's why I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's important for us to talk about what we feel are agents and flows, because you might have a very different opinion, and we all want to be on the same page for this talk. So flows are how we do traditional automation. There's a predefined series of steps, and they're always executed in the same sequence. Flows receive inputs, and they always churn out the same reliable outputs, the same ones each and every time. The order of actions might be executed differently depending on how control structures are set up, like if statements or do loops, but those all have to be pre-considered in advance. Otherwise, your flows blow up, they don't work, they have exceptions. Flows are not very resilient. Agents are. So agents are the new kid on the block, and instead of using code, and we use a little bit of code to build them, we use a lot of natural English language too. And so when they receive inputs such as a message, they use large language models to interpret that message, figure out what the intent of it was, and then build a plan, right? Build a plan of actions to address them. Agents also receive inputs like flows, but the outputs that they give might be slightly different every time, to their benefit. Agents aren't meant to work exactly the same as flows. And we create agents in many places, but of course, this is Power Platform Conference. We're talking about Copilot Studio today. not M365 Agent Builder or Azure AI Foundry agents. We're talking about Copilot Studio. And so this is a little diagram that I whipped up of what an agent looks like. So like I said, agents receive inputs and they're interpreted by that orchestrator over there. The orchestrator uses a large language model like GPT 4.0 or 4.1 or 5.0 in order to determine the intent of a message. It compares them to its instructions, and then it determines what to do next, right? Build that plan of action. And it has knowledge and tools that it's able to apply to that plan to get stuff done. In this case, the knowledge that this agent is using is from SharePoint, from Azure AI Search, or from files that are directly uploaded to the agent. And then the agent also has tools to help it accomplish its task, like Outlook to send a message or Excel to modify or create a spreadsheet. So a question that was on my mind when I was building this presentation was, is an AI model an agent? We open up AI Builder, we create prompt actions, we create document processing models. Are those things AI agents? And I say no, because, well, they don't break down inputs to form a plan. They don't have an orchestrator, they don't do reasoning. All they just have is pure large language model magic, right? So by that same logic, if we were working with Power Automate and we just added one of these things to a flow, one of these AI models to a flow, that doesn't make it an AI agent either. So I just go back to the example of the Wizard of Oz and the Scarecrow. Scarecrow said, if I only had a brain, if I only had a brain. Scarecrow also had a mouth, right, so he could communicate. He had hands so he could craft things. He had feet so he could walk around, and he had a body to orchestrate all those limbs, right? So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, everything's off right now, so, okay.
All right, so what problem are we trying to solve with an agent versus a flow? There's a lot of similarities when it comes down to it. They both are automating business processes. They both are doing things. There's some key differences where an agent can be a chatbot, but it doesn't have to be a chatbot. It could be an autonomous process that runs in the back end. And so flows are fast. They generally run fast if they're properly written. They do the same thing every time. Agents can be slower, especially if you bring in deep reasoning and other things into it. They can perform high-value tasks and drive more ROI. They have you can more often bring a human into the loop, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. Agents use decision making and perform more closely to how a human approaches a problem versus something that's just a rules-based process. So do you want a flow or do you want an agent? So for example, the process follower that follows a process, think orchestration. We're going to talk about orchestration mindset during this time, which is not what a lot of people had with flows and workflows, which is a bunch of disconnected workflows that don't talk to each other, but rather an orchestration mindset of reusable components. Decision taker. If it needs to make a decision, it's more likely an agent. Now you can have simple decisions like conditional steps in a flow, etc. But if it is reasoning and making decisions, that's an agent. Rule checker, notifier, template filler, I'm not going to read all these. Those are all things, the more deterministic it gets or the more rules-based where it always follows the same thing every time. Think about anything you have that updates your SAP system. That likely is a flow. Because again, while the agent can be decisioning and be deciding when to do the process, you don't want the agent just deciding which fields to fill out with no human verification. Some specific examples. The inventories out of stock in SAP, that's a flow. Because again, it's something that is very rules-based, happens the same time each time, trigger-based, very straightforward. Route a support ticket to the correct person. Who here has used Dynamics customer service? Okay, so you know rules, routing rules, which essentially are very hard-coded. They go down a list till it hits a rule, it applies, and then executes the rule. But we all have seen every time you do that, especially large call centers, you've got cases where there's things fall through the cracks. The rules are looking for specific terms, and if that term doesn't apply, it sends it somewhere else or doesn't know what to do with it. Whereas I've seen call center routing rules turned into an agent that is off of a set of instructions like you would give the human agent, and it's very flexible not only to maintain but also to update. And there's lots of work and lots of trial and error that goes into that in doing that. So that I think is great examples. Extract information from a database. Respond to customer inquiry about so that's an example of one that could be a flow, or it could be an agent. But the thing to keep in mind is, how many of you get all these like automated emails, notifications that are driven by like workflows or Power Automate, and they always say the same thing, they're not interesting. You start tuning those out, right? Whereas if you have something that is more, gets the sentiment or gets the intent of the message and then creates a response, that is much more impactful and much more meaningful. So that's a perfect example of something that people have done traditionally as a flow that can actually work a lot better as an agent. So, should your flow be converted to an agent? Does it work? If it works, I would question, you need to have a good business reason to change it to an agent. Now, you might change it to an agent flow, which we'll talk about. I'm sorry, I'm still getting feedback. I'm going to stand away from that. But you might change to an agent flow, but in that case, it always needs to run the same way and it runs dependably. But keep in mind, a lot of flows are locking in yesterday's business process because they are basically designed on how the manual process works. So let's build it as a flow, and that can create what's called lock-in, which basically you are basically enshrining yesterday's business process, not building it in a future-facing way. So it's just some decisions, and there's more than 3 outcomes, but this is the simplified version. I gave Matt a flow chart that had like 10 different paths, and it got a little complex, so we boiled it down. So, does the process always need to run the same way, following the same steps? Keep it as a flow. Does it need decisioning, reasoning? Does it, is it super dynamic? Think of your average onboarding process that it has a certain flow it follows, but there's all these edge cases. You got subcontractors, you got union people, you've got all these different things that need to follow different cases, or if the process that changes every week, it seems like. That's a key use case for an agent. And then there's the middle ground, which is we can bring prompts into our flows. We can use flows as tools in our agents, so it's not binary. It's basically, one of the outcomes may be we have this keep the flow for that action, the updating of SAP, but we make it a tool inside an agent to make the decision around when to call it more dynamic. Oh, sorry, this is me. Requirement gathering. So when we have a process that is an agent versus a flow, first of all, I hope you're doing requirement gathering. In my opinion, the best part about Plan Designer is it gets people to follow the well-architected framework and actually do requirement gathering. Too many people jump in and start building things without even thinking through or getting the business case, or they play the telephone game and get secondhand information from somebody that talked to the business stakeholder and build it and then wind up with something that doesn't really work. But how would you approach requirement gathering for one versus the other? And again, both of them are very similar in that they're both automating processes, but for a flow, it's let's whiteboard out the process. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Versus the agent is, if I was describing this process to a person, how would I describe it? There's similarities there, but there's nuance differences in that spectrum. So some things that are similar. When I'm sitting down, and I do this every week, and talk to somebody who wants to do agents, automation, etc., I always start with, walk me through what you do now, what's good about the process, what is not so good about the process, and from there I'm looking for things like, does it change a lot? Is it dynamic? You know, how many steps does it need to go through? But then, you know, what are the rules? What are the related things to that process that you need to do? What are the decisions you need to make in the process? And then the notifications or the approvals, how many levels do we have to go through? I love the new enhanced approvals that come with agent flows because they give us the ability to more intelligently restart the process. They have, for matrix type scenarios, it's just a lot better. And so you also though want to consider, you know, what are the channels that we're going to be using it for? What does, you know, not just, especially for agents that are things that are chat-based, you have to consider like the user experience of that, where a flow is generally a background process. You know, what minimum set of features do we need? How accurate does this need to be? And we want an accurate process, but there's different kinds of accuracy. If I'm getting financial data, calculating stuff, I want that to be 100%. Where something that is more of a dynamic process, it doesn't follow the way and adapt to how our process changes and works.
All right, it's time for the first demo of our presentation. So as we move from the planning portion of our talk, how do we plan agents versus flows, and move into the how do we build agents versus flows, I'd like to show you a short demo that I've built. So this is an agent that checks travel expense reports. It reviews them, and it asks the question, okay, is this expense report filled out correctly? It acts just like a first-line worker. I'm gonna hit the play button here, and we'll see how it works. So this is my expense report, and the first thing I'm highlighting is the fact that I have some duplicate expenses on my expense report. And I'm also highlighting some misclassified expenses. I have yellow cab taxi service, and it's classified as office supplies. That's not right. So when this Excel report is submitted, the agent first checks it out before passing it on to the first approver. And I know that this could work autonomously, but I decided to do it inside Copilot Studio so I can show you how the agent is thinking. Again, it's an Excel report, so it's using Code Interpreter to open up the Excel file and read it. So once it has the Excel file, it's going to start to build a plan, and you'll see two sub-agents appear. The first is the duplicate expense items checker and the expense classifications checker. And on the right-hand side, you see how the agent is thinking. In the first message, you can see Air Canada is a duplicate expense, and then you've got expense codes. And in that final flow action, the agent is going into that Excel file and updating it. It's highlighting the areas that the user needs to go back and check out. So we'll open up the Excel file, and when we do, we have the sections highlighted in orange. And we would probably also send a message back to that user explaining why we've highlighted those sections and why they need to resubmit it. So there it is. That's the first flow demo and an example of multi-agents.
And I was going to add that is a process that we have seen or we built with Power Automate before, and it's just very hard coded. And you're looking for things, you maybe have exceptions you've seen in the past, you're hard coding in there. It never works great, but an agent can make sense of the intent and do it much better, much faster.
Okay, let's talk about how does building agents versus flows differ. We'll start with data modeling. Data modeling is analyzing the data requirements for your project. What are the systems that my data sits in? What are the tables? What are the file shares? Sometimes creating new places to go ahead and store that data, and then coming up with the conceptual model of it. In traditional automation and applications, our data looks something like this. We've got tables to store data in. We've got different types of constraints in place and types of data. We've got relationships between those tables. What do we call this, right? We call this thing an entity relationship diagram, and the data being displayed in it is called structured data, right? Structured data.
Isn't that a table relationship diagram now, since they renamed entities tables?
Yeah, I guess so. Microsoft marketing department is working overtime on renaming products, I guess, yeah. So agents can interact with structured data, but they're very powerful, more powerful, because they can also interact with unstructured data as well. So what do I mean by unstructured data? I mean things like FAQs or policy documents, narrative text, stuff you might store inside of a SharePoint document library. Those documents might not just include text too, they might include things like images and charts, and the agents can interpret those things as well. Now, surprisingly, the good indicators of data quality for agents versus flows are pretty similar, and I suppose I meant unstructured versus structured data. The biggest thing I find that comes up in agents projects is the consistency of data. Let's say you have a policy document that says employees are entitled to 3 weeks of vacation in one place and 4 weeks in another. How does the agent know which one to choose? I mean, the fact is that it doesn't, but we find these inside of our messy document libraries all of the time. So keeping these things straight is hard. The agent doesn't solve that problem. It's still up as humans to be able to go ahead and do that. And of course, keeping data current, right? That's a challenge no matter what you're gonna do, whether it's structured data or an agent. Let's talk a little bit about data sources. So unstructured data can come from multiple places, and it's really important to understand the limitations of each knowledge source that you can use. First, let's talk about web pages. How do they actually grab information? Well, they're grabbing live information from the internet for a URL that you specify. And the limitation is, even though it's real-time data, or real-time-ish, it only grabs 2 levels down from the root URL that you choose. So it's not actually looking at the entire site. If you want to get past that limitation, you need to use something called Bing Custom Search, which allows you to fully navigate the entire website if you want to, or basically customize it however you like. But that one is pay for play, and you do need to pay a little bit of extra money to do it. Also, if it's behind a username or password, you can't get at it if you're looking at a web page. For SharePoint, we have many documents stored inside of SharePoint document libraries, and wouldn't it be great if our agents could access information from there? So you can get information from sites, right? Content that's directly on a page inside of a site, from a document library, from a list. Behind the scenes, the agent is using SharePoint Search. And I always get the question, if we have a document in a document library and that user shouldn't see it, will the agent be able to? The answer is no, because the agent always uses the logged in user's context. I'll say that once again. The agent always uses the logged in user's context if you're using Microsoft Authentication. So if you have the correct security trimming in place, the agent will respect it as long as the user logged in is logged in under their own username and password. Then let's talk about file uploads and just, about the quality of each of these data sources and the answers that they return. So file uploads will give you the best accuracy for answering questions, and I find that they're the fastest too. Why? Because file uploads use something called vector search. When you upload a file directly to an agent, it turns the document into embeddings, puts it in a vector database, and when you type in your query, performs a vector search to get that information back. Unlike SharePoint, which is using SharePoint search, and web, which is using Bing search. So it's a lot faster, a lot more accurate. You can upload bigger file sizes. But the downside is that if you've uploaded the file to the agent, well, everybody's going to be able to see it. Unlike SharePoint, where it respects the security trimmings. So as long as everybody in the agent, that's using the agent, should be able to access that file, go ahead and use file upload. 2 more hot tips for you. So I mentioned that SharePoint, it's a great data source, but maybe it's not as accurate as doing a file upload. Well, you can use something called file synchronization to get the best of both worlds. So right there in your little menu for adding knowledge, you can pick upload and synchronize a SharePoint site. And it's taking files from the SharePoint site and uploading them directly to your agent. It does respect the security trimmings. It does convert those files to embeddings. But you do have to have you have to have space in Dataverse to be able to store these files. That's where the synchronization is happening. But I really, really like that because you don't need to do any extra setup between SharePoint and the agent to get the synchronization to work. And if you have the time and the money to set it up, Azure AI Search, I find, gives the highest quality answers. So it's a custom AI search engine inside of Azure. It's the fastest, it has the best accuracy, but again, the best things in life aren't free. So have to pay a little bit for that. It's about $100 a month, I think, for one index. But Azure AI Search gives me the best results.
Human in the loop. So what do we mean by human in the loop? If you look at all the workflows that you're familiar with, all the flows you've used, the ones that try to end-to-end automate the process and take the people out of it, generally are not very successful. Now, certain things, if it's just a background synchronization data or something like that, but as I mentioned before, if you use a deterministic process, you can lock into old practices and your business is changing, so your automation needs to get smarter and change too. Now, you can bring humans into the loop of a Power Automate flow just as easily as you can a Copilot Studio agent, but there's key differences that we'll talk about why agents are better for bringing humans into the loop. So, why do we want humans in the loop? Basically, flows that run a full back end-to-end process. People are very important to our process. As much as we hear about AI firing everybody, the reality is there are people needed for whether it's approvals, for input, for kicking off the process, for getting the inputs to the variance of the process based on what humans do. And agents have the ability to put people more in the loop. Because think about it, you've got agents, first of all, many of them are chat-based or initiated by chat. And that is something where, versus a flow that is usually a scheduled process or a data-triggered process, or you've got on-demand, but essentially you can, from the agent, get context, get details, get reference from the person that indicates what the agent should do. So the question to ask yourself, what level of risk am I willing to accept? What we mean by that is, when you have a process that brings humans into the loop, there's always a bit of unpredictability. The flows are dependable because they always do the same thing. You bring people into the mix, it gets a little bit messy because your person can start chatting about something totally different, and that can lead to some things that are a bit unpredictable. When should we escalate to a human? This is a key thing that in a flow, typically you have a canned routine that brings it to the person. Like the approval flow is the most commonly used one there. Whereas some things, we want to have it more intelligently route to a human and more intelligently pull a human in. Do we want the agent to decide who in the organization should approve? This is a good example of, you have the process, like the approval process that starts really super clean. Go to the manager. If it's above that, go to the vice president. If it's $1 million, you got to go to the CEO. But then you factor in, that person might be on jury duty, or that person, in these types, we want to send it there. And I've seen a lot of customers have continual rework of their approval flows because they keep coming across exception cases and having to bring that in, and then it gets really complicated. So this is an example of more of an agentic approval process. And this was actually shown during the keynote this morning. The idea is you still have your general flow, your general process it goes through, but you've got human readable instructions there that have the use cases. And if those change frequently, it's much easier to update the instruction set than to update the code or the script, if you will. Because again, it's something we've seen customers where that changes every 2 weeks, no kidding. Or during the summer months, it changes to this. During the winter months, it changes to that. The more of those conditions you have, the better an agent is at that type of human in the loop. And then this is an example where, and a lot of these points we're making, you can apply them to flows as well as agents. So one of the key concepts is you should, even with your flows, look at bringing humans into the loop more through things like adaptive cards. That's a great way to do that. As we discussed, though, an agent can also be more intelligent about the message that goes to the human. Now, if you have, going back here, if you have certain information you need to capture, you do want to have more of a rules base to make sure, like, to update the expense in SAP, I've got to capture these fields and these types of data. And that's where, something like this works well. But having your agent to be able to kind of make up to come up with the topics instead of hard coding everything, and to come up with more dynamic wording versus pre-programmed hard-coded messages, and then also giving the ability with generative answers to have more of the GPT-like experience. People don't like generally now the old PVA question 1, question 2, question 3. There's still a point for that, which is if I need specific information for validation of the person, or I need to make sure I capture like these specific things, topics are still very useful, but that's where the generative answers give a much more pleasant human-in-the-loop experience.
Next up, agent to agent. So automation has always been about taking a large task and breaking it down into more smaller, manageable tasks so we can go ahead and automate them. And so you probably know who that guy is right there. His name is Henry Ford. He was the founder of Ford Motor Company, and his big innovation was the assembly line. I don't need to explain to you what an assembly line is, but I used to work at a bus manufacturer, so I kind of know the history of cars a little bit. And before the assembly line, we had something called stationary assembly. So the car stayed in one spot, and they had a skilled team of artisans working on it from start to finish, so they had to have absolutely every skill. And they put together the car bit by bit, and sometimes they would even make their own custom parts for the car, which is absolutely crazy when you think about things like product quality, right? But how does the assembly line work in contrast? Well, you have workers on the line, the product comes over to them, they have specialized jobs, so they're really, really good at those jobs, and the car moves through there a lot faster with a lot more quality. I think that cars used to take something like 2 or 3 weeks to build, and now cars come off the line within 24 hours or less, right? That's how he was able to get the cost of the Model T down so well. Shouldn't touch that thing right there. So how does breaking apart tasks into smaller, more manageable bits differ between agents and flows? So let's take a quick look right here. You're probably familiar with this. This is Power Automate, and on the left-hand side we have something called a parent flow, and on the right-hand side we have something called a child flow. And let's imagine that this parent flow is really, really long and complex. I know you can only see a few bits on the screen. Let's imagine it goes all the way down into like the sub-basement of this facility, and there's many different paths the automation can go on, right? Many different scenarios, and it takes 5 minutes to execute. So that's probably scaring everybody in the audience, right? And guess what? That thing breaks down right in the middle, so it's super duper hard to diagnose. Darn. So what I like to do is I like to break these really long flows into smaller, more manageable child flows, and they really help me be able to diagnose whether the small bit of what it's meant to do is executing properly. I can break things into smaller testable bits, and it's easier for me to manage as the developer. Now, when we talk about child flows, you'll hear folks say things like, they're reusable, that's the primary reason that you want to build them. And I personally say no, because how many times have I reused just a chunk of a child flow? I think that they're just better so that we as developers can understand what we do when we come back, right? Because smaller, more testable chunks, and again, like more reliable. How do we think about agents? Agents are a little bit different. So here we have a parent agent on the left-hand side, and we have a series of sub-agents on the right. In the example that I showed you earlier, we had a travel expense report agent, and we had multiple sub-agents, one to check for duplicate expenses and another to check account code classifications. Now, who in the audience has built an agent with a really, really long set of instructions? A couple people. How reliable was that agent? Keep your hands up if it was super reliable. No, agents have a hard time with long sets of instructions too. So one way that we can succeed as agent builders is to break those instructions down into smaller sub-agents. We can put subsets of the instructions into sub-agents, and we can also give those agents only the specific set of tools that they need to execute that set of instructions, right? We are containerizing our agent. We're making sure that it can't use tools when it's inappropriate. We're kind of like walling it off, right? It's in a container. Multi-agents also allow for use, that's true, and there's probably more opportunities than in flows. There's probably more opportunities than in flows because there's lots of simple knowledge agents that we like to build where they're just connecting to a data source and answering a question. Those things can kind of be used all over the place. And it's also true that Yeah, you can have multiple teams working on agents at once if you use a multi-agents architecture. But if you've ever tripped over another developer building an agent in a flow before, that's actually quite difficult to coordinate. So I say that the primary benefit of doing this really is making sure that your agents are more reliable and execute the instructions as they need to. There are a couple of gotchas when you're using agents. For instance, you can't call M365 declarative agents at this time, right? So if you're building an agent inside of Microsoft 365 Agent Builder, I think it's had a couple of different names.
Copilot Studio Lite.
Copilot Studio Lite, thank you very much. So you can't connect to those types of agents. Performance was another one with agent to agent. If you think about it, a parent agent has to call a sub-agent. Then the sub-agent has to talk, to itself with the orchestrator, come up with the answer, send the agent back to the parent agent, and then the parent agent has to spit those results back out to the user. And so it does cause a little bit of delay in getting an answer. Now, there are two types of agents right now. I call them sub-agents and standalone agents. There's not really any clear terminology for this, like from Microsoft, on what we're really supposed to call these, but I call them sub-agents versus standalone agents. Sub-agents are embedded inside of the parent agent and they can't be separated from it. You can't reuse those agents in other places, so you want to use them when they're just breaking down that very long set of instructions for that agent. And they're faster to operate too because they sit inside of the same agent. There's no real calling back and forth. They're really just kind of the same thing, but a container around instructions, tools, and knowledge. But for the standalone agents are a completely separate agent. So you'll build agent number 1 in Copilot Studio, you'll go off and you'll build agent number 2, and then you'll connect them both. That's the idea of a standalone agent. And those can be reused across different projects. I did mention Copilot Studio is where you build a standalone agent, sub-agent, or agent to agent, but you can build them on other platforms as well. So today you can build them on Azure AI Foundry. You can build them in Microsoft Fabric. I think in preview I saw a Microsoft 365 SDK when I went to copilotstudio.preview.microsoft.com. That's a hidden place where you can check out all the preview features. So. But the point is, you can integrate other agent platforms with Copilot Studio and not just build your sub-agents there. You'll remember that I called out the performance of agent to agent, specifically in standalone agent scenarios. One way that you can make your agents faster and have like kind of a shared set of functionality you can reuse is to use something called component collections. And these I feel are underutilized. So component collections are not a separate agent. They're just tools that you share between agents. Let's say that I did a lot of work to set up a special tool for ServiceNow, like to create or update tickets or get knowledge from there. Things like tools or topics or flows. You can share those components between agents. You can have a library of shared components by using component collections. And yes, they are an underutilized tool, but they are directly called by the agent, so they are a lot faster than using agent to agent. So consider them when you're building them.
And one more thought on the I get asked all the time, should I use child agents, should I use components, should I use MCP servers? The general concept is you want to come up with what is the most performant, best performing way for you and what you want to do. But the componentized architecture is definitely what you should consider for reusability, for getting away from the monolith agent that tries to do everything. And it's like there's benefits and use cases for each of those tools, but really following a orchestrator calling tools where you have a bunch of tools and a smaller number of orchestrator type agents is really the way to go. So let's talk about security. Security when it comes to flows versus agents is very similar. You have the same concerns with agents you have with flows, but you have some additional ones. So what are the things for any solution built on the Power Platform, Copilot Studio, Power Automate? You need to consider environments, security roles, data loss prevention policies, environments, the normal things you would do with any Dataverse, Dynamics, type solution. But what do you need to consider when it comes to security of your agents? Agents, you've got some additional considerations. One is, especially when you are putting your data out in front of users in the form of an agent, they will find things that they wouldn't normally find if it was just a deterministic flow. So you need to pay extra close attention to things like your document security if you're feeding document data into it, or your SharePoint or other things where you're exposing data to an agent. And also, if you have autonomous agents, within the set of instructions for the agent, is it doing things in a secure manner? Then you've got your things like moderation for your responsible AI. Are people going to get bad advice? Or are they going to get things that could potentially, especially you turn it on for a customer, then then you need to be extra careful about it, because it could give, there's been court cases like the Canadian airline that had to honor fees that the agent said that they had to honor. So that's the kind of thing. But then also, another thing people don't think about is the channel security where it's being deployed. Like, we have this agent, we want people using this channel, be it Teams, be it Microsoft 365 Copilot, to be able to do it. So I share the agent with them, but they don't have access to the SharePoint library the agent points to. Well, then they're not going to get good experience. So those are the main things that you need to think about. And the responsible AI framework is something Microsoft has put a lot of use cases in. Sometimes Microsoft gets criticized because people say, well, I tried it in Copilot Studio and it didn't give me the same answers it did when I just went in with ChatGPT. Well, the reason is because Microsoft is building in responsible AI and then giving you the ability to change things like the moderation level and things like that. But essentially, we have a large customer that Matt's working on a project with right now that made the comment that they appreciated that. They were trying all these other platforms, and Microsoft was the only one that provided that kind of out of the box. Everyone else, the people building the agents, had to think and manually design that into the agent. It's also things such as fairness and things like that. So, for example, there was a use case about a bank and recommending different policies and risk levels. It was recommending more for one gender versus another, and so making sure you're checking for fairness and equality and things like that in your design. You'll see here what I mentioned. You have the ability to control the content moderation level, and if you want further control, like you find out that it's too moderated for your use case, you can also bring your own model, any model, and have more granular control over what you do there.
Question for the audience: who here plays video games? All right. Who here plays the video game Civilization? All right, a couple of Civ fans. That's my favorite video game series of all time. So Civilization is my favorite video game series, and what you do is you take an ancient civilization and you build it up to kind of the near future. You research different technologies as you go. And a lot of the quotes from this presentation come from that video game, so you might have noticed that. This is the quote that appears when you successfully research rocketry. A good rule for rocket experimenters to follow is this: always assume it will explode. And that's not a knock on agents, right? Like, that's everything that you're testing. What happens when things go bad? What happens when it explodes? What should we do? How should we test things? So I'm going to show you, there we go. So the mindset for agent versus flows is a little bit different. Remember that I told you could put the same old set of reliable inputs into a flow and get the same old set of reliable outputs. You can pretty much have 100% success rate on your tests and know when it goes into production, it's going to work unless it times out or something like that. But agents, right, they have emergent behaviors. Those outputs don't always come out the same. They could be a little bit different. So we can't be shooting for 100% success rate here. We do have to make sure we're able to accept a little bit of risk, mitigated by the safety features that Joel was just talking about. So I like to think of it as, what's my minimum acceptable success rate instead, right? What is it for you? 98, 99%, 95, something like that? When we're building flows, I think about, have we covered all the scenarios that we possibly could? When I'm planning for that, I can probably think about what all those things are right at the start of the project and then go in and program all of those exceptions. With agents, well, they create their plans on the fly. So you can't test everything beforehand or everything that might come up, but you have to ask yourself, what are the guardrails that you put in place when something unexpected happens? And finally, yeah, does the flow output the proper values? That's all we really want in the end, right? We want a flow that makes the sausage. You put the meat in, it grinds it, and you get a nice, tasty sausage out. But in the agent world, we might ask ourselves, not only does it give us the correct outputs, but did it formulate the correct plan to go and do those things? Did it formulate the correct plan? Did it use the right actions to get there? And so I'm going to show you the second demo of the day, and this is a demonstration of test automation. Before I press play here, give you a little bit of context. Working on a project right now, and in order to move one set of functionality from development into production, what we have to do is something like 30, 40, 50 different tests, right? Because this agent does a lot of stuff, it can answer a lot of different questions from knowledge, and we need to make sure it's answering those questions correctly. Now, that's really, really annoying to type by hand, right? So we're using test automation instead now, along with Copilot Studio Kit, because they've released some new features recently that allow us to use Microsoft authenticated agents to do that. So let's take a look at how this all works. So this is the Copilot Studio Kit, which is downloadable for free on Microsoft's GitHub. Right now I'm showing you the employment standards agent, which is configured for test automation. And here we're able to test a Microsoft authenticated agent. So you put in the values right there to specify which agent you're going to use. You can check off analyze with generated answers. And here are all the questions that we want to run the agent through. This is called my test set. To create a new test, what you do is you type in some unique value to identify the question. I just like to use a name and a number. You put in your test utterance, and then over on the right there, you put in your expected response. Okay, so we have a question and an answer. I'm gonna go ahead and click play right here. So that particular set of tests had like 20 or 30 tests. So I picked my agent, and I picked the test set I want to apply to it. And when I press the save button, it's gonna start running through all 30 tests right there. Actually, in this case, it's 12. I was thinking of a different example. Then this thing takes, I don't know, just about a few minutes to run. And once it's done, you close it, and you've got your results. We will scroll down here so we can see there were some successful results and some failures, which is expected. And which one are we going to open up? We're going to open up a failure here because we want to know what went wrong. So here we have a failed question. The question was, what are the rules around overtime pay? And it had an expected response of 1.5 times regular hourly wage, a couple other details, and it didn't quite match what was inside the response, so it failed. One thing that you might be wondering is, okay, like how does this test suite know that the answer is right? This actually works using AI builder prompts in the background. So after the agent returns a result for a test, it's fed into an AI prompt as an input against Microsoft's pre-built test auditing prompt, and then outputs the result. So if you download the Copilot Studio Kit and use test automation, it's going to save you a whole heck of time, and I encourage you to do that before you release any agent to production. Another thing that you got to think about with agents is, what's our strategy to continually improve agent outcomes post-launch? When we set that flow out into the world, we considered the full amount of possibilities of what it can do. But with agents, right, especially knowledge-based agents, there might be questions people that are asking that the agent isn't answering. So what we want to do is we want to monitor the conversations as they're coming in, continually updating our agent in order to improve it. There's a couple out-of-the-box tools that you can use to monitor conversations built into Copilot Studio. I also recommend using Copilot Studio Kit to monitor conversation KPIs. And Joel, would you like to tell us a little bit about this new savings feature here?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, how many of you track ROI on your automations or your agents? Okay. How many of you have tried to do that but aren't really doing it regularly? Yeah, that's been my experience too. There's been tools like the COE Starter Kit that let people track ROI, but it's fairly reactive, where both Power Automate and Copilot Studio now have built-in savings tracking. So if I want to see over time, am I getting the results that I wanted from this agent or the projected ROI, it will track by each run of the process and rules that we set in standard KPI categorization. And that's why it's good, because it's built into the system. Nothing else you need to configure other than the rules you want to use to track that. And from this, I can really see, am I getting the value? If not, either it's not used or it's not saving us as much as we thought it would do. Why is that? And we can investigate, we can optimize it. Maybe we dump this one because it's not giving us good results. But that's where bringing that ROI mindset in for both your flows and your agents is great, and especially now that the system will track that for you if you set it up. That is a preview feature right now. And we are at the 10-minute point. I just want to talk briefly on, and by the way, this works with the analytics inside of Copilot Studio as well. So if you set this up on your agents, you can bring that into the analytics reports.
Awesome. Yeah, we're doing great on time. We've only got 2 more sections here. So let's talk about deployment of agents versus flows. How do they differ? By the way, I used a Bruce Springsteen quote here. I'm not really sure if that guy on the left-hand side of the screen is Bruce Springsteen, because I'm Canadian. I know he's an American icon. So I hope I got that one right. How are flows and agents the same when it comes to deploying them? What do I mean by deployment? I mean moving our agents and flows from the development environment over to the QA environment for testing and over to the production environment for usage. So agents and flows are both built on the Power Platform, so they both use Power Platform solutions. But agents add a new wrinkle into the mix, add a new wrinkle called channels, right? How is the person going to use this agent? Where is it going to be exposed to them? When we build an application and automation, that's usually built in, right? But when we're building an agent, we have to decide what channel we're going to apply it to as well. So this is what a solution looks like. Apps and agents are something that you add to solutions. Solutions are nothing more than a folder where all of the components for that agent that you built are organized. Now, when we move things from the development environment to the production environment, it's really hard to remember what are all the things I should do to move them there, right? You don't want to miss a piece. So if you keep them organized in this special type of folder called a solution, you can move that folder from one environment to the other, and then you won't miss a beat. We've also got something called pipelines. I've been talking about moving agents from one place to the other, exporting the agent from development and importing it into the test environment. You can do that with something called a pipeline. And if you use a pipeline rather than doing it manually, well, it's always going to happen the same way every time. Things can't get into production without going through testing first. You can also do source control, which means version control through things like Git. Let's talk about channels. Where is your agent going to be used? Are you going to have your agent usable in Microsoft Teams or Microsoft 365 chat? Do you want it to be exposed via email or text message? The important thing to know is that each and every channel that you use has limitations or constraints on its use. So you want to do a little bit of research beforehand. Just picking a couple of these out here. A lot of agents get deployed to Microsoft Teams, but something we don't consider in advance is there's no refresh button that lets you restart the conversation, much like when you are talking with M365 Copilot. There's no restart conversation button. So you're actually having a really long conversation with the agent from the start of its life until now, right? So you've got to consider, how do you have to build your agent differently, knowing that. Also things like, if you're deploying to WhatsApp, that can use adaptive cards, so you've got to just use text. I guess email and SMS work pretty much the same way. But the point is, once you know where the agents are going to be deployed, what channel they're going to be deployed to, work backwards from that. Work backwards like you're cooking a nice meal. See when you have to turn the oven on, right? I'm always really bad at that. I forget to boil the darn water every time. But look backwards from that, and don't feel like you have to memorize all of this, because you can research it just in time.
All right, so I get the last topic, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Our favorite topic is licensing, and this is a key consideration for both agents and flows And we've mentioned a couple times, but agent flows are a new form of Power Automate flow that run under the Copilot Studio license rather than the Power Automate license. They do now have a few special powers like the enhanced approvals and the human-in-the-loop steps, but in essence, they're 99% Power Automate. But there's some key considerations that you might want to consider for when you might switch a flow to an agent flow or start using Copilot Studio. One of the big things is there's no distinction of premium versus standard connectors here anymore. It doesn't cost any more to use premium connectors versus standard. And I have multiple examples of customers that would never touch premium Power Automate connectors that are using them all the time in agent flows. And that's simply by removing that. And it also goes to more of a consumption-based pricing versus a mandatory license for each person. That's part of it as well. You don't need a license for your developers. One other thing that happened recently, and I'm going to jump ahead here a slide or two, some key changes happened to the licensing. You now have, under the Microsoft 365 Copilot license, the ability to run pretty much all you can eat agent flows up to a certain level of complexity. It's like 100 API calls. And you can also, as part of that license, trigger moderately complex custom Copilot Studio agents. In my opinion, that makes the 365 Copilot subscription much more compelling because it essentially makes the cost much more predictable. And also then you might have some flows that you wrote on standard licenses or standard connectors to save money. Now if you have people that have 365 Copilot licenses, it makes sense to bring them into Dataverse or premium connectors because we can use that as part of the 365 Copilot license if they have that. And that for some customers has been enough to justify getting Microsoft 365 Copilot for everybody because it will help control their costs there. There's a lot more we could talk about, but essentially, I guess to wrap this up as we are in our last 4 minutes here, if your flow is working, and the last thing was, do agent builders need a license? No, that's another key thing is your makers can use it without having to have a special license, but you do need to grant them the license for that. So just, I guess to wrap up, agents versus flow, it's not versus, it's and figuring out kind of your strategy and playbook around when you use each and how you use them together. Keeping in mind, your flows can be tools called by your agents. As we saw this morning, now your flows can call an agent. And so we don't need to rip out everything and rebuild as agents, but certain things, especially the ones that are more decisioning based, or the ones that would make more sense as agent flows for cost considerations, et cetera, or future reusability, you may want to look at modernizing them.
So we are nearing the end of our time here within 2 or 3 minutes, so I think it'd be pretty tough to go around and answer questions at this point.
I said I was going to have everybody do introductions at the beginning, but Matt said that was a bad idea. But we are at booth 239 in the Expo Hall. It's the Hitachi Solutions booth. We would love to have a conversation with you. I'll be there later this afternoon around 4. So feel free to come by and ask us questions or catch us after the session.
Yeah, please do consider attending the Agent Hack on Wednesday. It starts at 5:30 to 9:30, put on by Microsoft, and it's a great place to get hands-on help from Microsoft building your first agents.
Oh,
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming to the talk.
One more thing, we are having a drawing at our booth, and it's